They told me the apple pie was out again same day the town canceled the Veterans Parade. Again. Name's Elijah, 78, ex-Marine. The coffee was burnt, the lights too bright, and the cold from the AC cut through my jacket like I never left Quezon. Left my old glove on the counter by accident. Or maybe not. Ever felt invisible in the very place you helped protect? The bell over the pharmacy door jingled faintly as a tall, weathered man in a faded green jacket stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room like he'd lived in it a lifetime ago. The warmth inside Bell Ridge Pharmacy and Cafe barely fought off the chill of the November wind that had followed him through the door. The man paused for a moment, his gaze drifting across the Formica booths over the glowing red digits of the soda machine, and finally landing on the familiar curve of the coffee urn behind the counter. He reached into his coat, pulling out a cracked leather wallet. A sliver of a card peeked out, brittle, barely clinging to the vinyl sleeve. If one looked closely, they'd read Department of Veterans Affairs, issued 1969, though the ink had faded like memory. Jonah Miller, standing behind the counter, didn't look up right away. His Bluetooth earpiece blinked softly as he muttered into his phone, nodding at something unseen. He half-turned, registering movement, and managed a distracted "morning, sir," without meeting the man's eyes. Elijah Brooks gave a gentle nod and made his way toward the counter. His fedora cast a quiet shadow over his eyes, but his posture, rigid upright, spoke of a time when standing tall meant something. He looked past Jonah, taking in the shelves of overstocked multivitamins and hand-drawn buy local signs tacked up with peeling tape. "I'll have a black coffee," Elijah said, voice low and smooth like vinyl static. Jonah sighed, pressing a button on the coffee machine that hissed in protest. "No apple pie today. Out of stock. Again. You can try the organic bagels, though." Elijah didn't flinch. He simply nodded, pulling a few folded bills from his wallet and placing them on the counter with practiced ease. "I guess no one orders the bagels," Jonah muttered more to himself, glancing toward the display case where a single sesame bagel sat under a flickering light. Tried to modernize the place. Elijah didn't answer. He turned and walked slowly to the window seat, a corner booth by the jukebox that hadn't worked since 2004. The glass was fogged at the edges, but Elijah wiped it with his glove, revealing the courthouse square beyond. A small boy stood near the war memorial. Elijah watched quietly as the child, no older than 6 or 7, yanked a miniature American flag from the dirt and waved it like a toy sword. A woman nearby glanced but said nothing. The boy ran off, flag forgotten in the gutter. Jonah leaned against the counter, arms folded, eyeing the man. "You got family in town?" he asked, tone casual but unsure, like a boy trying out a tie that didn't fit. "Used to," Elijah replied, eyes never leaving the window. "Town changes." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but dense like fog over still water. The 2 old men near the back continued their domino game. One of them, a wiry fellow with tobacco-stained fingers, gave Elijah a slow nod as he passed. Elijah returned it with a ghost of a smile. At the counter, Jonah scrolled absently through his phone. A real estate listing popped up: Beachfront Cafe, Cape Coral, FL. Low taxes, high foot traffic. He stared at the numbers but didn't seem to see them. Elijah stood, reached into his coat again, and placed a single $1 in the tip jar. The bill fluttered slightly from the door's sudden gust as he stepped outside. He nodded once more at the domino players, who replied with silence and subtle acknowledgement. The wind slammed the door shut behind him, rattling the cafe's windows. Sinatra had finished. Nat King Cole's Autumn Leaves drifted in soft and melancholy. Jonah turned to the tip jar. He raised an eyebrow, surprised, then looked down behind the counter. There, near the edge of the floor mat, lay a glove, faded brown leather with the initials EB stitched in dark blue thread just above the wrist. Jonah pocketed the glove absent-mindedly, unaware the initials match a barely legible name on the broken veteran's plaque outside. The following morning, Jonah found a crumpled note beneath the sugar canister. "Tell the lady I'll pay for the pie next time." He turned it over, half expecting a name, a number, something just the neat, slanted handwriting and faded ink. The note smelled faintly of cinnamon and cold leather. Sitting on the counter nearby was the glove still damp along its stitched seam. He hadn't moved it since yesterday, as if afraid it might vanish if touched again. Outside, a pale frost clung to the cafe's windows like lace. The square lay empty but for the ruts of bicycles and early footsteps. Across the street, a flag fluttered stiffly against its pole, stubborn in the face of November wind. Jonah tugged down the sleeves of a maroon sweater that barely met his wrists. The logo from Belridge High's 2008 football team had cracked and peeled years ago, but it fit better than the morning chill. He rubbed his hands together and flicked on the radio. And across the country, communities prepare to honor their veterans this Saturday with ceremonies, concerts, and remembrances, the announcer said. Some parades sadly remain canceled due to city budget restrictions. He switched it off, more irritated by the reminder than the cold. Behind him, the front door opened with a gentle creak. "Smells like the 60s in here," said a voice with a laugh. Mrs. Miller stepped in, arms full of brown paper bags, breath clouding the air. Her cheeks were pink from the walk over. She set the bags down and began unpacking oat cinnamon, a handful of ripe bananas already spotting. "You make oatmeal from scratch now?" Jonah asked, amused. "For the ones who can't chew bagels," she replied, humming the first few bars of Moon River. She moved with a rhythm born of habit, her hands dancing between pots and ladles like a conductor's baton. Jonah nodded toward the glove and note. "That old guy Elijah came in yesterday. Sat by the window." Mrs. Miller paused, spoon hovering above the pot. "Elijah Brooks," she said, her voice softer now. "Used to come every year around this time, like clockwork. Always sat by the window, always ordered the same thing. Then he just stopped. 5 years ago, maybe more." "What happened?" She shrugged, stirring slowly. "No one really knew. Folks said he lost someone. Maybe a son, maybe a friend." Jonah turned the note over again. "You think he'll be back?" "Maybe," she said. "Some people don't like saying goodbye twice." From the far end of the room, a voice cracked through the stillness. Elijah said Mr. Peters, who had settled into his regular corner with a newspaper he mostly pretended to read. "Knew him. Long time back." Mrs. Miller stepped closer. "You did?" "Mm-hmm," Mr. Peters murmured. "'80s, maybe. My cousin ran with him. Vietnam. Said Elijah pulled him out of a mess in Khe Sanh. Real quiet guy. Carried a compass instead of a watch." "You sure?" Jonah asked, raising an eyebrow. Mr. Peters nodded. Not many Elijahs with eyes like that. Like he'd seen the inside of something no one else had. The clock above the register ticked past 11. At exactly noon, the bell over the door chimed again. Elijah stepped in same green coat, same fedora, same quiet gaze that swept the cafe as though it remembered him better than he remembered it. Without a word, he approached the counter. "Coffee?" Jonah asked, already reaching for the pot. Elijah gave a nod. "And pie, if there's some left." Jonah blinked. Yeah, there is." The pie was warm cinnamon curling into the air. Jonah brought it to the window table himself, setting it down with a small glass of water. Elijah took a slow bite, then stared out toward the square again. Jonah hesitated, then sat opposite him, folding his arms on the table. So, why now Elijah didn't look at him. Just kept watching the wind play with a forgotten flyer on the courthouse steps. "Anniversaries have a way of pulling old bones out," he said finally. The pie between them sat mostly untouched. That evening, Jonah sat on the worn leather couch in his apartment above the cafe. His laptop balanced on his knees, he typed Elijah Brooks Belridge into a search engine. At first, nothing. a few links about school board meetings and a 1997 pie baking contest. Then he found it tucked away in an old military forum thread titled "The Ones Who Never Spoke." A grainy black-and-white photograph time-stamped March 1972. Two soldiers crouched in front of a smoldering jungle. One held the other limp and unconscious in his arms. The man holding him had Elijah's face, except younger, harder, unreadable. Jonah leaned forward, heart thudding. The image file name reads, Brooks Final Salute, JPG. Jonah stares, chills running down his back. Friday morning, Jonah stepped outside to smoke and noticed someone had placed a single white rose beside the rusted flagpole. He stared at it for a long moment, the cigarette forgotten between his fingers. Dew clung to the petals, gathering in the curve of each fold like tears unwilling to fall. The stem was wrapped in twine, tied in a loose bow. No card, no name. He took a drag, exhaled slowly, and scanned the square. Empty save for the occasional car rattling by and the lazy twirl of dead leaves in the gutter. The town felt quieter than usual, like it was holding its breath. Faded bunting hung crooked from a railing near the courthouse steps, its red dulled to rust its white-tinged gray. A streamer from some long-past celebration clung to a lamppost shredded by wind and time. Back inside the cafe, the radio played softly something instrumental with strings. Jonah poured himself coffee and looked up when Mrs. Miller walked in carrying a brown envelope and her usual hint of vanilla perfume. "You're early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, setting the envelope down. "Cold gets in my bones these days." He nodded toward the window. "Someone left a rose by the flagpole." Mrs. Miller stilled. Then, almost under her breath, he tried to organize a parade once. "Elijah. That was years ago. No one showed up." Jonah looked back at the window. "Why didn't anyone come?" She shrugged. "Busy. Tired. Some just didn't care." He marched anyway, alone. Outside, the bell above the door chimed. Elijah entered. No green jacket today. Instead, he wore a crisp white shirt, sleeves neatly rolled. The cold didn't seem to touch him. In his hands, a folded American flag and a small envelope. Without a word, he crossed the cafe and stepped into the post office next door. Jonah followed slowly, curiosity overriding hesitation. Inside the post office, Mr. Kellerman stood behind the counter, stooped, wiry, his limp more pronounced on colder days. He blinked when he saw Elijah. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Elijah Brooks. Been a while." Elijah gave a small smile. "Didn't want to miss another November." He handed over the envelope. The label read, "Families of Unit Echo KIA 1969. Kellerman read it, expression tightening. "They'll appreciate it, even if it's late." Elijah nodded. Some things are never too late. Back at the cafe, Jonah stood by the bulletin board staring at a new scrap of paper thumbtacked in the lower corner, written in the same familiar slanted hand. "Veterans deserve memory, not silence." He didn't notice Elijah come back in until the man sat down at his usual table, folding the empty pie plate napkin with deliberate care. Jonah approached, clearing his throat. "You ever regret coming back?" he asked. Elijah didn't look up, just said quietly, "Not yet. There's one more thing left to do." That night, long after the cafe closed, Jonah sat alone in the upstairs apartment. He turned the glove over in his hands, then opened a small wooden box used to be his grandfather's cigar case. Inside, he placed the glove and a printed photo Elijah holding a fellow soldier in that scorched jungle. A memory made tangible. Mrs. Miller's voice echoed in his mind from earlier. Some people carry the weight quietly, others run. He didn't know yet which one he was, but he was beginning to care. The torn parade banner had sat in the back supply closet for years, folded, forgotten, speckled with dust. He found it around midnight, gently shook out the creases, and climbed a wobbly stool to hang it above the pharmacy's entrance. No one saw him do it. But the next morning they would. The wind picked up as he stepped back onto the sidewalk. The rope on the old flagpole clanked softly a hollow rhythm against the rusted metal. And then he saw it. A Marine SUV, black and square, pulling up across the street. It parked slowly. No one stepped out yet. Elijah looked up from his pie eyes fixed on it. The Marine stepped out of the SUV, boots hitting the pavement like punctuation marks. He walked straight toward the cafe, ignoring the gawking townsfolk. Jonah was mid-pour on a coffee refill when he heard the boots. Not just the sound, they meant something. Sharp, rhythmic, intentional. He turned toward the front door just as the bell chimed once, brittle and high. The man who entered filled the doorway with a quiet authority. Gunnery Sergeant Jonah guessed instinctively. Tall, square-shouldered, his face lined not by age but by knowing. The kind of knowing that came from heat loss and years of unfinished conversations. Jonah's hand trembled slightly as he set the carafe down. His mind snapped to that grainy image from days ago. Jungle behind smoke curling upward, a figure crouched over the fallen Elijah. Younger, yes, but unmistakable. The same eyes, the same silence. The Marine's eyes scanned the room, then landed on Elijah, seated as always near the window, fingers loosely curled around a white ceramic mug. Without a word, Sergeant Mitchell strode forward. His boots struck the tile once, twice, then stopped. In front of the whole cafe, Mrs. Miller, at the register Mr. Kellerman, by the pastry case 2 domino players mid-game. The Marine saluted. A stillness fell over the room. No whispered commentary, no polite cough. Even the coffee machine seemed to hush steam held in a quiet coil above the spout. Elijah stood slowly. He didn't return the salute at first. Instead, he reached into the inner lining of his coat and unpinned something carefully. 3 medals, sun-washed edges dulled but intact, rested briefly in his palm before he held them against his chest. Then, and only then, he lifted his hand in a steady return salute. Sergeant Mitchell spoke clearly, voice like gravel against steel. "Sir." "It's an honor." Unit Echo remembers. He reached into his own coat and produced a folded flag, the creases tight and reverent. On top of it, a cream envelope sealed in red wax. Elijah accepted both with a nod, fingers brushing the leather-gloved hand of the Marine. "This," Mitchell added, lowering his voice, "is from the men still standing." Every last one signed it. "We never forgot, and we never will." Mrs. Miller covered her mouth with both hands, eyes shining. Mr. Kellerman turned fully toward the scene Kane forgotten as he leaned forward. Behind the counter, Jonah dropped the plate he'd been drying. It hit the floor with a clean crack, splitting cleanly in half. The Marine turned to leave. He paused just before the door, then faced Elijah one last time. "Happy Veterans Day, sir." And then he was gone. The SUV started with a muffled growl, tires crunching softly against old asphalt as it rolled away. The silence lingered like incense. Elijah sat down again without ceremony, folding the envelope carefully into his coat pocket. The flag he placed on the seat beside him. One by one, the cafe's patrons stirred. The domino players stood first, awkward, a little unsure, but they approached Elijah's table. Didn't know one said. Should've. "Thank you." The other nodded wordless and patted Elijah's shoulder before retreating to their table. Mrs. Miller brought over a fresh slice of apple pie, no charge. She set it down without a word, just a hand to his forearm. Even Kellerman made his slow, deliberate way across the floor, offering Elijah a firm handshake. No words passed between them. Outside, the sunlight warmed the frost off the benches. Flags hung still, but somehow they didn't feel forgotten. Jonah watched all of it from behind the counter. Something inside him shifted slow but real, like thawing earth. He didn't fully understand what he was seeing, but he knew enough to recognize weight. After the cafe emptied, Jonah stepped outside for air. The town square looked different. Not newer, not fixed, just noticed. Across the street, a man in a gray jacket snapped photos near the flagpole. Jonah squinted. Not local. Definitely not press. The man caught Jonah's eye and crossed the street. "You, Jonah?" he asked, lowering his camera. "Yeah. Who's asking?" The man smiled short and professional. "Marine told me it was you. Said, 'That's the guy who found him.'" He raised his camera again, the lens catching a glint of late morning sun. 3 days later, the town's paper ran a front-page article, "Local Hero Rediscovered." The photo showed Elijah in profile gazing toward the square. Mrs. Miller folded the newspaper with a kind of quiet care, as though it were something fragile. She slid it next to the cash register beside a small wooden shadow box. Inside, lit by the flicker of the cafe lights, rested Elijah's worn glove, EB stitched in faded thread, now framed like something sacred. Rain tapped at the windows, soft and steady. The sky hung low over Belridge, a blanket of dull gray. Jonah wiped down the counter, absent-mindedly, eyes drawn again and again to the photo on the newspaper. Elijah didn't pose. He rarely did anything for show. But the shot caught something real the way he looked toward the square, like waiting for a memory to appear. At 10:03 a.m. sharp, the bell over the door gave its tired chime. Elijah entered, same coat, same stride, but something in him had settled. He nodded at Jonah and slid into his usual booth. "Apple pie?" Jonah called out, already reaching for the plate. "No charge," he added as he set it down. Elijah didn't argue, just gave a slight smile, the kind that barely tugged the corners of his mouth. They talked weather first, then news, and then slowly about things that mattered more. "You ever miss it?" Jonah asked at one point, meaning the uniform, the life, the noise. Elijah took a sip of coffee, eyes on the drizzle beyond the window. "Sometimes. But mostly I miss the ones who never got the chance to miss it." The door opened again, not a customer, but Mr. Kellerman, arms full of mail wrapped in plastic from the rain. He shuffled over, setting the stack on the counter with a grunt. "Got one for you, Elijah." Hand addressed. Elijah's brow furrowed. He turned the envelope over slowly. The return name was smudged, the ink faded, but when he opened it, his hand trembled. It was from a widow of a man he once served with. The letter spoke of memories, pain, forgiveness, and of hearing Elijah might still be alive in Belridge. It ended with, "I never blamed you. Neither did he." He folded the letter slowly, tucking it into his coat like something too delicate to leave out in the open. Later that evening, the cafe was nearly empty. Jonah found Elijah asleep in the corner booth, head tilted against the window, one hand resting on a sealed envelope. He recognized the handwriting now, elegant, precise. The name on the front, Margaret Whitfield. "Who's that?" Jonah asked softly, not expecting an answer. Mrs. Miller, wiping down nearby tables, paused. "Gold Star Mother," she said, her voice low. "Her son. He died in Vietnam. Elijah used to visit her every year, until he didn't." "No forwarding address?" Jonah asked. Mrs. Miller shook her head. "She passed maybe 4 years ago. But maybe that letter still belongs somewhere." The next morning, Jonah made a quiet trip of his own. He drove the 2-lane road out of Belridge past forgotten barns and leaf-drenched fields. The VFW hall in the next town over had few people inside, but enough to listen. An older man with trembling hands took the letter and read the name. "She used to come by," he said, voice cracking. "Even after he died. She'd sit by the memorial, talk like he was still listening." Jonah retrieved the letter that evening. It didn't belong in a mailbox. Instead, he walked it across the square in the drizzle boot's wet jacket drawn tight. He stopped at the memorial stone black granite flecked with raindrops. He bent down, placed the letter just beneath the engraved name, Private Daniel Whitfield, KIA, 1969. He stayed there a moment, said nothing. Just let the rain fall. By dawn, someone had found it. A white rose rested now at the base of the stone. Beneath it, a note in neat cursive. He came back. "I forgive him." The cafe filled slowly that day. A few more customers than usual. Most glanced at the shadow box, some paused at the newspaper. One man asked about Elijah, another just nodded at him as he passed. Jonah didn't say much. He poured coffee, wiped counters, and kept his eye on the man in the corner booth. That night, he stood outside under the cafe awning watching Elijah through the window. The older man stirred sugar into his cup, lost in thought. Jonah pulled out his phone and typed a message. "To Gwen, I think I'm staying, at least for a while." He hesitated, then hit send. A moment later, the screen lit up. From Gwen, "That place needed you." He looked up, rain still falling in the street. The town hushed and breathing. Behind the glass, Elijah sipped his coffee, and for the first time, Jonah realized it wasn't just the cafe that was warming again. It was them. On Thanksgiving morning, the cafe opened early. Not for business, for remembrance. There was no open sign flipped, no menu boards written out. But inside, the warm glow of hanging bulbs reflected off the front window, and the smell of roasted squash and cinnamon apple drifted into the sleepy street. Mismatched chairs were gathered and rows tables pushed together and covered in faded linens. Foil-wrapped casseroles and steaming pies lined the counter. Jonah moved quietly through the space, checking on the kettle, retying twine around paper flags drawn by neighborhood kids. They fluttered above the tables, red, white, blue, and hand-shaped turkeys in crayon smiles. At 7:58 a.m., the bell over the door jingled. Elijah stepped inside, a slight bend to his posture, but there was a calm in his walk. He wasn't the first to arrive, but the cafe paused for him anyway. Jonah met him near the register with 2 cups of coffee already steaming. "I saved the corner booth," Jonah said. Elijah shook his head. "Not today. Let's sit somewhere. Central." They took seats in the middle across from each other. The tables slowly filled veterans, elders, couples who hadn't been out in years, teenagers who came only because their grandmother insisted. Mrs. Miller floated between groups, apron dusted with flower cheeks bright. A boy with cow-licked hair stood awkwardly near Elijah. "Were you really in the jungle?" he asked, clutching a napkin with a poem scrawled in uneven pencil. Elijah smiled gently. "Yes." "Was it scary?" He thought for a moment. "Yes. But the hard part was afterward." The boy nodded solemnly as if he understood. He didn't. But maybe one day he would. Midway through the meal, the pastor stood to offer a short blessing. It was simple, spoken without grandeur. For memory, for mercy, for those who stayed and those who left us. Then, one by one, hands reached across tables. Rolls were passed. Laughter began to float up, soft and uneven, like learning to speak after years of quiet. Elijah ate slowly, savoring each bite. At one point, he rested a hand on Jonah's forearm. "You did this," he said, not as praise, but as passing of something heavier and older. Jonah looked around. We did. He stood a few minutes later, tapping a spoon against his glass. Silence followed like a familiar friend. "I'm not great with speeches," Jonah began, "but this year taught me something. That dignity isn't in the uniforms or medals. It's in showing up, in sitting beside someone who thinks no one sees them. So today I just want to say, thank you for seeing." A hush, then steady applause. Not loud, not long, but whole. Elijah rose beside him, lifting his cup. To those who came home, he said, voice clear, and those who never could. That afternoon, as pies were cleared and old songs hummed from the jukebox, the cafe lingered open longer than usual. No one wanted to be the first to leave. The bell over the door rang soft with each goodbye until only a few remained. That evening, Jonah walked alone to the courthouse square. The memorial plaque, once rusted and overlooked, had been polished. A single candle flickered beneath it. He knelt and lit a second. The brass letters shone faintly in the dusk light. Elijah Brooks, Unit Echo, never forgotten. Behind him, wind rustled the bare branches. Somewhere down the block, a television buzzed inside a window. Life was going on, but here in the hush between day and night, something felt settled. As Jonah stood to leave, he looked back once more. His coat drawn tight, hands deep in his pockets, he whispered the line Elijah had once said. Some people carry the weight quietly. He turned toward the glow of the cafe where new chairs had been pushed together and warm lights still beckoned. Others make room for them. Sometimes the quietest tables hold the loudest echoes of sacrifice. In a small cafe among mismatched chairs and shared slices of pie, one man's return reminded a town of the dignity it had nearly forgotten. Kindness, when offered freely and without judgment, has the power to mend more than broken memories. It can heal entire communities. Like a folded flag placed gently on a counter, silent acts of grace can speak louder than any parade. So maybe today, look twice at the person sitting alone. You might just be witnessing someone's quiet courage coming home.